What's up, pop culture detectives? For a decade, they were the untouchable kings of music, seven brothers who conquered the globe. But 2026 hit us with a massive plot twist nobody saw coming. Whispers of silent treatments, clashing solo ambitions, and an undeniable distance have shaken the internet. What really went down behind closed doors when the camera stopped rolling? Are their legendary bonds breaking under the crushing weight of their legacy, or is this just a painful evolution? Did the pressure finally crack the diamond? Get ready to uncover the untold tension. This is the real reason they distanced themselves, the 7 hottest BTS conflicts of 2026.
Number 7. Jin, the Silver Screen Rebellion, Hyung's ultimate ultimatum. Let's dive into the eldest Hyung, Kim Seok-jin. For over a decade, Jin was the unshakable pillar, the eternal mood maker, the worldwide handsome shield that protected the younger members from the crushing anxiety of global stardom and relentless media scrutiny. But fast forward to early 2026, and the narrative took a sharp, almost cinematic turn that left the entire internet and the fandom completely paralyzed in disbelief. Picture this. It's the highly anticipated 2026 mega comeback, the monumental year BTS was supposed to reunite in full, undeniable force after finally closing the chapter on all their mandatory military duties. The global stage was set, the massive stadium tours were aggressively booked, and the world was holding its collective breath for the King's triumphant return. But behind the heavily guarded, closed doors of HYBE's top-floor executive meeting rooms, an entirely different kind of script was being written, literally. Whispers and leaks began to bleed into the mainstream press that Jin had landed a mammoth, career-defining lead role in a massive international streaming blockbuster. We are not just talking about a cute 5-minute cameo or a lighthearted romantic comedy. We are talking about a dark, gritty, multi-million-dollar psychological thriller production that required months of intense, grueling method-acting filming across 3 different continents, smack in the middle of the proposed world tour preparation. You have to truly understand the profound psychological weight and the historical context of this exact moment for Jin. Ever since his early university days studying acting at the prestigious Jungkook University, this was his holy grail, the singular dream that existed long before the concept of BTS was even born. He willingly gave up his personal, individual dream for years, suppressing the serious actor inside to be the reliable vocal backbone and the cheerful, sacrificial older brother of the world's biggest boy band. Now, at 33 years old, holding a heavy script that could permanently redefine his entire legacy outside of the group's colossal shadow, he was faced with an impossible, gut-wrenching choice. The tension within the group didn't erupt in dramatic theatrical screaming matches like you see in the movies. Instead, it manifested in a deafening, heavy, and suffocating silence that filled the practice rooms. Industry insiders reported that during the intense 12-hour choreography rehearsals for their comeback single, Jin was physically present but mentally miles away, operating on a dangerous 2 hours of sleep, frantically juggling complex script readings at 3 in the morning and grueling, physically demanding dance practices at 8 in the morning. The physical and emotional exhaustion began to prominently show. The signature room lighting dad jokes vanished entirely, replaced by a hollow, strained exhaustion and dark circles that makeup couldn't hide, which the other members couldn't simply ignore or laugh off anymore. This wasn't just a simple logistical scheduling conflict. It was a profound, existential identity crisis. For the very first time in his life and his career, Jin drew a hard, unyielding line in the sand. He aggressively demanded schedule flexibility and a temporary step back from certain group promotional activities, a demand that the label and allegedly some of the fiercely dedicated younger members who were desperate for a flawless, uninterrupted group reunion after years apart found incredibly difficult to accommodate without derailing the entire multi-million-dollar comeback machine. Was it truly selfish of him to finally prioritize his individual, lifelong dream after sacrificing his youth, his privacy, and his 20s for the team? Or was it fundamentally unfair to disrupt the synchronized, delicately balanced machinery of the group's highly publicized and eagerly awaited return? The noticeable distance grew not from a place of malice or anger, but from a tragic, heartbreaking misalignment of personal timelines and years of unspoken sacrifices bubbling to the surface. It is heavily rumored that during a crucial make-or-break late-night crisis meeting in February 2026, the atmosphere grew so incredibly thick and suffocating you could cut it with a knife. Jin, usually the reliable one to break the ice and ease the tension, simply laid his highlighted, worn-out script on the table, looked his brothers dead in the eye, and asked them a quiet, devastating question that would echo through the entire year. When is it my turn to just be Kim Seok-jin? This single, piercing moment of raw vulnerability forced the group into an incredibly uncomfortable corner, highlighting a fracture no one wanted to admit existed. The eagle-eyed fans instantly started noticing the subtle, undeniable shifts in the dynamic, the way he subconsciously stood slightly apart in group promotional photos, the unusually delayed and brief responses on social media interactions, the separate, solitary flights to overseas schedules while the others traveled together. The relentless media immediately spun it as a massive, scandalous rift, a betrayal of the sacred brotherhood. But the reality behind the scenes was far more agonizing, complex, and painfully human. It was the agonizing growing pains of a man who realized that to finally save himself and honor his own soul, he might have to slowly let go of the very hands he had held tightly for a decade. He wasn't walking away from BTS out of spite, he was walking towards himself, fighting tooth and nail against the corporate machine to prove he was infinitely more than just the visual, more than just the eldest Hyung whose sole purpose was to serve the group. He desperately wanted respect as a standalone artist in his own domain, free from the heavy expectations of the idol industry. This intense clash of burning solo ambition versus deep-rooted group loyalty wasn't just a corporate headache for HYBE, it was a deeply emotional fracture that threatened to redefine their entire dynamic. It begs the ultimate, uncomfortable question that every fan must confront. How long can you reasonably ask someone to put their own deeply held dreams on hold for the sake of a collective legacy, no matter how legendary that legacy might be? The fallout from this single monumental decision in early 2026 sent shockwaves not just through the fandom, but through the entire Korean entertainment industry, which had always upheld BTS as the untouchable gold standard of group cohesion and unbreakable unity. Industry analysts and cultural commentators spent hundreds of hours dissecting every single frame of their public appearances, searching for micro-expressions of resentment or hidden support among the other 6 members. But the truth behind the scenes was far more agonizing, complex, and painfully human. It was the agonizing growing pains of a man who realized that to finally save himself and honor his own soul, he might have to slowly let go of the very hands he had held tightly for a decade. He wasn't walking away from BTS out of spite, he was walking towards himself, fighting tooth and nail against the corporate machine to prove he was infinitely more than just the visual, more than just the eldest Hyung whose sole purpose was to serve the group. He desperately wanted respect as a standalone artist in his own domain, free from the heavy expectations of the idol industry. This intense clash of burning solo ambition versus deep-rooted group loyalty wasn't just a corporate headache for HYBE, it was a deeply emotional fracture that threatened to redefine their entire dynamic. It begs the ultimate, uncomfortable question that every fan must confront. How long can you reasonably ask someone to put their own deeply held dreams on hold for the sake of a collective legacy, no matter how legendary that legacy might be?
Number 6. RM, The Weight of the Crown, a leader's intellectual rebellion. Moving down the list to a man whose very shoulders have carried the crushing, unimaginable weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire for over a decade, we have the brilliant architect himself, Kim Namjoon, globally known as RM. If Jin's conflict was a battle for physical presence and personal screen time, RM's 2026 crisis was a deeply internal, profoundly philosophical earthquake that threatened to shatter the very ideological foundation of BTS. To truly grasp the magnitude of this invisible war, you have to rewind and look at the unprecedented, suffocating role HYBE and the global media forced upon a young kid from Ilsan who originally just wanted to write underground hip-hop and read classic literature in peace. For years, RM wasn't just a pop star. He was weaponized as a cultural diplomat, a flawless English-speaking shield, the designated intellectual who had to stand at the podium of the United Nations, shake hands with the president at the White House, and eloquently articulate the hopes, fears, and political stances of an entire global youth generation. He absorbed the agonizing pressure of speaking for 7 wildly different men, carefully filtering every single word in countless international interviews to protect the group's immaculate, controversy-free image. But as 2026 dawned and the monumental, highly anticipated post-military group reunion loomed closer, the heavy, glittering crown finally became too toxic to bear. The explosive conflict ignited not over scheduling, but over the fundamental artistic soul of BTS's next musical era. Behind the sleek, soundproofed walls of HYBE's creative studios, a brutal ideological war was silently raging. The corporate executives, desperately hungry to reclaim their undisputed dominance on the Billboard charts after a years-long group hiatus, presented the members with a mathematically engineered, aggressively upbeat English-language pop anthem, a guaranteed safe viral TikTok hit designed to smoothly restart the money-making machine. But RM, who had spent his solitary military years and the immediate aftermath completely dismantling his idol persona through brutally honest, critically acclaimed solo projects like Indigo and the experimental avant-garde masterpiece Right Place, Wrong Person, vehemently rejected the proposal. The industry insiders whispered about a legendary, chilling boardroom meeting where RM, usually the ultimate pacifier and voice of reason, flat out refused to compromise his evolved artistic integrity. He passionately argued that returning with a manufactured bubblegum pop track as men in their 30s, after experiencing the profound isolation and maturity of their respective journeys, was not just artistically regressive, but intellectually dishonest to themselves and to the fans who had grown up alongside them. He fiercely demanded that their grand 2026 comeback album be entirely self-produced, heavily leaning into raw, uncomfortable social commentary, alternative hip-hop, and deep psychological reflections on aging, disillusionment, and the terrifying emptiness of fame. Concepts that the label's risk-averse marketing department deemed entirely unmarketable and terrifyingly alienating to the mainstream public. This wasn't merely a creative disagreement, it was a full-blown intellectual rebellion against the very idol system he helped legitimize. The tension bled intensely into the group dynamic, creating a fascinating but heartbreaking rift. Members like J-Hope and Jimin, who deeply valued the energetic, synchronized performance aspect and the sheer joy of reconnecting with the massive stadium crowds, found themselves agonizingly caught in the middle of this creative tug-of-war. Suga, though fully sympathetic to RM's burning artistic frustrations, clashed with him over the agonizing delays this philosophical stubbornness was causing to the carefully mapped-out global comeback timeline. The distance became palpable and increasingly physical. Instead of practically living in the HYBE studio complex as he had done for a decade, RM began aggressively isolating himself, embarking on what fans lovingly but anxiously called Namjooning on an extreme, unprecedented scale. He vanished for weeks at a time to remote, obscure contemporary art galleries in rural Japan, secluded sculpture parks in Europe, and underground indie music haunts in Seoul, deliberately surrounding himself with unconventional painters, indie musicians, and avant-garde curators who saw him strictly as Kim Namjoon the artist, not RM the global K-pop leader. His social media presence transformed into a cryptic, entirely depersonalized feed of abstract art, empty architectural spaces, and heavy literary quotes, completely devoid of the typical reassuring idol interactions the fandom was desperately starving for during the reunion buildup. The media ruthlessly spun this isolation as a tragic, ego-driven abandonment of his leadership duties, but the brutal reality was that RM was fighting desperately to prevent his own psychological annihilation. He remembered his own heartbreaking, tearful confession during the infamous 2022 Festa dinner, where he admitted, "I don't know what kind of group we are anymore," and he was utterly terrified of plunging back into that same soul-crushing identity crisis. He firmly believed that if BTS didn't drastically mutate into a mature, legacy-driven, self-sustaining artistic entity, akin to legendary bands like Coldplay or Radiohead, rather than desperately trying to compete with the fleeting, hyper-energetic trends of fourth and fifth-generation boy groups, they would eventually become hollow caricatures of their former selves. The agonizing conflict of 2026 forced the entire group to confront a terrifying reality. The brilliant, infallible glue that had held them together through every storm was now actively, intentionally dissolving the old, comfortable bonds in order to force them into a painful, necessary evolution. RM was essentially gambling the immediate, guaranteed commercial success of the 2026 reunion on the line for long-term artistic survival. And that massive, uncompromising gamble created an incredibly tense, emotionally charged atmosphere where every single conversation felt like walking on broken glass. It was a magnificent, heartbreaking tragedy of a man who loved his brothers deeply, but realized that to truly lead them into their next era, he had to be willing to fiercely stand alone, even if it meant temporarily breaking the very empire he built.
Number 5. Suga, the producer's ultimatum, a shadow's refusal to dance. Let's dive into the quietest but arguably the most formidable force within the septet, Min Yoongi, the genius producer known globally as Suga, and the fiercely independent August D. To understand the explosive, deeply hidden 2026 conflict surrounding Yoongi, you have to completely strip away the glitz of the idol world and look at the raw, scarred, and calloused hands of a man who literally bled for his music since his underground days in Daegu, starving just to buy basic MIDI equipment. Fast forward to the highly anticipated 2026 reunion preparations. While the rest of the world was eagerly counting down the days until they could see the legendary 7 synchronized dancers back on massive stadium stages, a colossal, immovable roadblock had permanently parked itself right in the middle of HYBE's Grand Performance Planning Committee. Yoongi had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. During his breathtakingly raw solo D-Day tour years prior and his subsequent alternative military service period, he hadn't just grown as an artist, he had entirely metamorphosed into an untouchable, fiercely autonomous musical entity. He had tasted the intoxicating, unadulterated freedom of commanding massive, sold-out arenas globally, armed with absolutely nothing but a microphone, a live band, a grand piano, and his raw, unfiltered rage and vulnerability. No heavy, restrictive, synchronized choreography, no manufactured idol smiles or forced camera interactions, just pure, bleeding musicianship and storytelling. So when the 2026 comeback blueprint was aggressively laid out on the boardroom table, featuring grueling, back-breaking 10-hour daily dance rehearsals to recapture the youthful, hyper-energetic, explosive performances of their On, DNA, or Fire eras, Yoongi practically laughed. But it wasn't a joke. It was a cold, hard, unyielding wall of rejection that sent absolute shivers down the spine of the creative directors. The physical reality was undeniable and brutal. At 33 years old, despite the successful 2020 surgery that finally fixed his torn labrum, his historically injured shoulder, a lingering, painful ghost from that infamous pre-debut delivery accident in 2012 that he hid for years while swallowing painkillers in secret, was loudly, agonizingly protesting the extreme, superhuman physical demands of a massive 50-city global stadium tour. But the 2026 conflict was infinitely deeper than just physical pain and medical limitations. It was a massive philosophical war over the group's evolving identity and legacy. Yoongi heavily and relentlessly advocated for a drastic, mature shift in their live performances. He passionately argued, behind heavily guarded closed doors, that BTS needed to permanently drop the grueling synchronized boy band routines and transition into a legendary live band vocal and rap powerhouse, sitting on stools, playing instruments, and letting the sheer, unadulterated power of their monumental discography speak entirely for itself. This radical proposition sent absolute shockwaves of panic through the label's executives, who were terrified of losing the visual spectacle that sold out stadiums, and it created an agonizing, palpable tension with the group's fiercely dedicated dance line, particularly J-Hope and Jimin. For the performance unit, their very artistic identities and ways of connecting with the massive crowds were deeply intertwined with their breathtaking physical performances. They felt that abandoning the choreography was abandoning the very essence of what made them BTS. The distance that subsequently formed between Yoongi and the rest wasn't loud, dramatic, or explosive. It was a chilling, isolating freeze that was far more terrifying. Yoongi simply retreated into the pitch-black, heavily fortified sanctuary of his genius lab. Industry insiders, audio engineers, and backup dancers whispered constantly about the eerie, heavy silence during the highly publicized rehearsals. Yoongi would completely skip the physically punishing morning choreography sessions, opting instead to meticulously obsess over the live band arrangements, string section orchestrations, and vocal mixing until 4 or 5 in the morning, entirely alone in the dark. Communication with the other members severely deteriorated, reduced to cold, professional emails carrying heavy audio files and mix notes, rather than the usual chaotic, loving banter in their private group chats. He was intentionally distancing himself to protect his fragile physical health and his hard-won artistic sanity, brutally compartmentalizing his role as Suga, the BTS member, who had to comply with corporate demands, and Min Yoongi, the visionary producer, who flat-out refused to compromise. The heartbreaking reality was that Yoongi felt deeply, agonizingly misunderstood by the very people he considered his lifelong brothers. He wasn't trying to sabotage the grand reunion or steal the spotlight. He was desperately trying to save them all from becoming aging caricatures of their younger selves, breaking their bodies to desperately meet an impossible nostalgic expectation set by a notoriously fickle industry that discards idols the exact moment they show human weakness. He wanted the world to respect his brothers as untouchable, seasoned musicians, a legacy act like the Rolling Stones or Coldplay, not just perfectly trained dancing machines performing for the corporate bottom line. But this fiercely protective, logically driven, and seemingly cold approach came across as emotionally detached and stubbornly uncompromising to members who were already vibrating with the massive, crippling anxiety of stepping back into the blinding global spotlight after years apart. It heavily alienated him from the collective emotional excitement of the reunion, making him look like the reluctant participant. Rumors wildly circulated that during a particularly explosive, tear-filled group confrontation in late April 2026, Yoongi sat silently in the corner of the mirrored practice room, clutching his heavily iced shoulder, looking at the exhausted, sweat-drenched faces of his younger members, and brutally told the massive management team that if they forced him to perform the agonizing, high-impact choreography of their early 20s, they would be actively signing the death warrant for his musical career, because his body simply would not survive another global run. It was an earth-shattering ultimatum: adapt to our maturity, respect our physical boundaries, or watch the entire machine break down entirely under the weight of its own ambition.
Eagle-eyed fans noticed the terrifying distance when leaked snippets of a 2026 documentary showed Yoongi completely separated from the group's chaotic dinners, choosing instead to eat alone in the studio, surrounded by synthesizers and empty coffee cups. This deeply hidden, agonizing standoff forced the entire group into a terrifying period of profound reflection, actively challenging their lifelong ingrained belief that pushing past their absolute physical limits and destroying their bodies was the only valid way to prove their love to the fans. Yoongi's defiant, solitary rebellion in 2026 wasn't a lack of dedication, it was the ultimate, painful act of tough love. It was a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to force a rigid industry and a deeply bonded brotherhood to realize that true longevity requires the absolute courage to completely rewrite the rules of the game, even if it means enduring the agonizing, freezing isolation of being the only one in the room willing to say a definitive, undeniable no.
Number 4. J-Hope, the golden cage of positivity, a dancer's silent mutiny. Let's shine a glaring, uncomfortable spotlight on the man who was universally dubbed the literal sunshine of the septet, the undisputed dance captain, and the emotional battery of the group, Jung Hoseok, universally adored as J-Hope. For over a decade, Hoseok carried the heaviest, most psychologically exhausting burden of them all, the terrifying, unrelenting obligation to be happy. He was the designated mood maker, the bright, eccentric, endlessly energetic core who absorbed the toxic stress of the other 6 members and transmuted it into pure, blinding positivity for the cameras. But what the global public catastrophically failed to realize as the highly anticipated 2026 reunion approached was that the sunshine had fundamentally, irrevocably burnt out. The seeds of this devastating internal conflict were sown years earlier with his critically acclaimed, staggeringly dark solo debut, Jack in the Box, and his subsequent history-making Lollapalooza headline set. During his solo era and his heavily disciplined military service, Hoseok had finally ripped off the suffocating, pastel-colored mask of the happy virus. He reconnected with his gritty, underground street dance roots in Gwangju, embracing a raw, aggressive, and deeply cynical artistic identity that completely rejected the heavily manufactured bubblegum aesthetic of the idol industry. So, when the massive, multi-million-dollar 2026 comeback machinery forcefully cranked into motion, demanding that the 32-year-old veteran revert back into the giggling, heart-flashing, hyper-energetic caricature of his early 20s, something inside him violently snapped. The conflict wasn't a sudden, screaming argument. It was a chilling, absolute silent mutiny that terrified the HYBE executives far more than any vocal outburst ever could. For the first time in BTS history, the legendary dance captain completely abdicated his role as the cheerful mediator. During the grueling 12-hour choreography camps meant to synchronize the group after years apart, Hoseok's demeanor was described by terrified backup dancers and choreographers as ice-cold, ruthlessly clinical, and completely devoid of his trademark booming laughter. He perfectly executed every single complex movement with terrifying robotic precision, but the soul, the joy, and the infectious energy that historically fueled the entire practice room were completely dead. The true epicenter of the 2026 rift erupted over the creative direction of their stage performances. The label, desperately pandering to the nostalgic, massive global fandom, pushed heavily for a bright, retro pop spectacle reminiscent of their Dynamite or Butter eras, safe, deeply commercial, and guaranteed to dominate the global charts and TikTok trends. Hoseok vehemently and aggressively rebelled against this blatant artistic regression. He fiercely demanded a radically dark, heavy hip-hop approach featuring complex, aggressive street dance routines, crumping, and raw, visceral storytelling that reflected the very real trauma and maturation they had all endured during their hiatus. He wanted to strip away the glitter and the fireworks and replace it with sweat, grit, and undeniable, aggressive authenticity. When the label inevitably pushed back,
Terrified of alienating their family-friendly global audience, Hoseok's response was a devastating, unprecedented withdrawal from the group's emotional core. He stopped attending the mandatory, heavily publicized group dinners and the heavily scripted behind-the-scenes promotional shoots, citing profound exhaustion. But the reality, widely whispered among industry insiders and deeply embedded street dancers, was that Hoseok was spending his nights completely off the grid, hiding under baseball caps and oversized hoodies, battling anonymously in underground hip-hop ciphers deep in the heart of Seoul. He was desperately seeking the raw, unfiltered passion and respect of the underground scene, because the highly sanitized corporate environment of the BTS comeback felt like a suffocating golden cage. This massive, unbridgeable disconnect created an incredibly agonizing tension with the younger members, especially Jimin and Jungkook, who historically relied heavily on Hoseok's bright, guiding energy to navigate their own crushing anxieties. His sudden, jarring transformation into a cold, hardened, and strictly professional perfectionist left a massive, gaping emotional void within the team dynamic that nobody else knew how to fill. The distance became so incredibly palpable that eagle-eyed fans began obsessively analyzing leaked, grainy rehearsal footage, terrified by the vast physical space Hoseok deliberately maintained between himself and the rest of the group during breaks, choosing to stare blankly at the studio mirror rather than engage in the usual chaotic banter. The relentless Korean media immediately smelled blood in the water, publishing wildly speculative articles about a supposed power struggle within the dance line. But the truth was a heartbreaking tragedy of personal growth clashing violently with corporate expectations. Hoseok was undergoing a brutal, agonizing metamorphosis in real time under the unforgiving glare of the global spotlight. He was fiercely fighting for the basic human right to be angry, to be tired, and to be profoundly complex, flat out refusing to be endlessly commodified as a one-dimensional beacon of hope for a world that constantly demanded his energy, but rarely stopped to ask if his own battery was completely dead. His 2026 rebellion wasn't an act of arrogance, it was a desperate, primal scream for authentic survival. He realized that if he forced himself to put on that bright, cartoonish smile just one more time to sell out a stadium, it would permanently destroy the fragile, authentic artist he had fought so hard to become during his years of isolation. It was the ultimate heartbreaking paradox. The man who had famously introduced himself for a decade as "I'm your hope, you're my hope," had finally realized that the only person he desperately needed to save in 2026 was himself. The profound psychological toll of this agonizing realization cannot be overstated. Imagine the sheer, crushing weight of knowing that millions of people worldwide rely on your radiant smile to cure their own depressions, to fuel their daily lives, and to find a sliver of light in a dark world. For years, Hoseok had willingly, almost martyrized himself, drinking that toxic chalice to keep the BTS ecosystem thriving. But by 2026, the emotional bankruptcy was absolute. He began openly clashing with HYBE's top-tier image consultants, flatly refusing to wear the colorful, eccentric, and heavily branded outfits that had defined his public persona for years, opting for stark, monochromatic, unbranded streetwear that served as a visual armor against the intrusive, demanding gaze of the public. This massive, waving red flag to the fandom was a silent but deafening broadcast that the J-Hope they thought they owned no longer existed. Furthermore, this intense internal battle bled deeply into the recording booth. When tasked with recording his verses for the highly anticipated lead single, a track heavily engineered by international hitmakers to be a mindless, catchy earworm, Hoseok reportedly locked himself inside his private studio for 3 straight days, rewriting his lyrics completely from scratch over 40 times. He systematically stripped away every single generic, crowd-pleasing English catchphrase the A&R team had suggested, violently replacing them with dense, aggressive, and rhythmically complex Korean wordplay that directly, albeit metaphorically, attacked the suffocating nature of the idol industry and the terrifying, hollow reality of ultimate fame.
When he finally submitted the vocal files, the sheer, unadulterated venom and raw, raspy aggression in his delivery left the lead producers completely speechless and terrified. It was a vocal performance so startlingly dark and uncompromising that it fundamentally forced the entire production team to alter the instrumental arrangement of the song just to match his terrifying newfound intensity. This uncompromising, iron-willed stance created a terrifying domino effect within the septet. Namjoon, while intellectually understanding Hoseok's need for authentic expression, was deeply panicked about the commercial viability and the cohesive narrative of the group's highly publicized return. The resulting friction was not born out of petty jealousy, but out of a terrifying existential dread that the group's synchronized heartbeat had finally, irrevocably splintered into 7 completely different, highly independent rhythms. Hoseok's 2026 conflict essentially forced the entire BTS machine to brutally confront the undeniable, terrifying fact that you simply cannot force a hardened, battle-tested 32-year-old street dance veteran back into the restrictive, neon-colored box of a teenage idol, no matter how many billions of dollars are riding on the line. The distance he created was a fiercely protective moat, a necessary boundary erected to guard his newly forged, fiercely independent artistic soul from being swallowed whole by the very corporate leviathan he helped build up from the ground up.
Number 3. Jimin, the Phantom of Perfection, a swan's bleeding canvas. Let's plunge right into the heartbreaking, deeply psychological battlefield of the man who has always been hailed as the ethereal, gravity-defying swan of the group, Park Jimin. For over a decade, Jimin's entire brand, his very artistic identity, was meticulously built on an incredibly fragile, terrifyingly high wire of absolute, unyielding perfection. He was the undisputed it boy of global K-pop, the man who would famously practice in the pitch-black dance studios until 3 in the morning, only to wake up at 6, aggressively critiquing every single micro-movement, every slight pitch variation, and every breath he took on stage. But as the monumental, highly scrutinized 2026 group reunion approached, this lifelong, obsessive pursuit of flawlessness mutated into a dark, self-destructive, and deeply isolating monster that threatened to completely consume him. To truly understand the gravity of this 2026 conflict, you must look at the brutal physical reality of aging in an industry that demands eternal youth. After completing his mandatory military service, where his body underwent rigorous, bulking physical training that fundamentally altered his center of gravity and his delicate vocal cords, Jimin returned to the HYBE practice rooms entirely changed. The impossibly high, angelic vocal registers he effortlessly commanded during the blood, sweat, and tears or spring day eras were suddenly requiring a terrifying amount of physical strain to reach. The 2026 crisis erupted not from a place of arrogance, but from a deeply ingrained, agonizing fear of disappointing the millions of fans who were desperately waiting for the flawless, ethereal Jimin of the past. The label's A&R executives, highly aware of these natural vocal changes, practically begged him to lower the original keys of their classic, demanding stadium anthems or heavily rely on advanced AI-assisted backing tracks to effortlessly mask any perceived vocal fatigue during the grueling 3-hour reunion concerts. But to Jimin, whose entire self-worth was inextricably tied to his raw, authentic stage presence and his critically acclaimed, hyper-vulnerable solo work like the Face album, this corporate suggestion was an absolute, unforgivable insult to his artistry. He flatly, aggressively refused to lip-sync a single note or artificially alter his legacy. This ignited a terrifying, behind-the-scenes war of attrition. Instead of compromising, Jimin violently retreated into an extreme, almost punitive isolation, locking himself inside private, heavily soundproofed vocal dungeons for excruciating 14-hour stretches.
Industry insiders and terrified vocal coaches leaked harrowing accounts of Jimin stubbornly forcing his voice to hit those impossible, piercing high notes over and over again until his throat physically bled, refusing to drink water or take breaks, driven by a blinding, obsessive panic that he was losing his magic. This terrifying physical self-sabotage created a massive, suffocating black cloud over the entire group dynamic. The tension wasn't an explosive argument, it was a deeply agonizing, helpless grief experienced by the other members who were forced to watch their beloved brother actively tear himself apart from the inside out. Taehyung and Jungkook, who historically shared the deepest, most intuitive emotional bonds with Jimin, found themselves entirely locked out of his heavily guarded fortress. When they desperately tried to stage an emotional intervention, pleading with him to accept his natural, beautiful vocal maturation and begging him to stop punishing himself, Jimin tragically perceived their loving concern as a devastating confirmation of his own deepest, darkest insecurities, that he was no longer good enough to stand beside them. He violently pushed them away, heavily erecting massive, impenetrable emotional walls that shattered the delicate, symbiotic harmony of the mutiny line. The distance became so painfully obvious that during the few heavily monitored promotional interviews they did together in early 2026, the global audience could physically feel the freezing temperature drop whenever the topic of their upcoming live vocal performances was brought up. Jimin would noticeably shrink back into his oversized chair, his legendary infectious eye smile replaced by a hollow, terrified, and highly defensive stare. His body language tightly closed off from the men sitting mere inches away from him. He stopped seeking physical comfort from the others, the famous tactile hugs and constant leaning on each other completely vanishing, replaced by a stiff, hyper-vigilant posture that screamed pure agony. This internal war inevitably escalated into a massive, fiery confrontation with the highest levels of HYBE management. Just weeks before the opening night of their record-breaking global tour, Jimin's vocal cords completely gave out during a grueling full-dress rehearsal, resulting in a terrifying, silent stage that left the entire production crew in absolute stunned horror. The medical team rushed in, threatening to forcefully cancel his participation in the entire tour if he didn't immediately undergo emergency vocal rest. It was at this exact devastating moment that the true depth of his 2026 conflict was laid bare. He broke down in the middle of the massive, empty stadium, surrounded by cold, glaring stage lights, crying a decade's worth of suppressed, agonizing tears. He confessed to the silent room that he felt like a complete fraud, absolutely terrified that if he couldn't hit the perfect angelic notes, the world would finally realize he was just a flawed, exhausted human being, and all the love would instantly vanish. This agonizing, deeply vulnerable breakdown forced the entire BTS machine into a massive, screeching halt. The 2026 rift wasn't about money, solo ambition, or creative control. It was a heartbreaking, desperate battle against the suffocating, toxic illusion of perfection that the idol industry had ruthlessly hammered into his skull since he was a teenager. The distance he created was born purely out of shame, a desperate attempt to hide his perceived weaknesses from the brothers he admired so deeply and the fans he loved so fiercely. It was the ultimate tragic paradox of Park Jimin, the man who spent his entire life mastering the art of the perfect, flawless performance, had entirely forgotten how to simply exist as a beautifully flawed, evolving human being. This intense, harrowing crisis forced the entire BTS machine to completely restructure their 2026 comeback, actively forcing the executives to permanently lower the keys and completely redesign the choreography to prioritize longevity and raw, human emotion over flawless, mechanical execution. Jimin's excruciatingly painful journey in 2026 was a massive, brutal wake-up call for the entire global entertainment industry, brutally proving that the pursuit of absolute perfection is not a noble artistic goal, but a terrifying, violently destructive phantom that will eventually devour you alive if you don't learn how to finally, bravely shatter the mirror.
Number 2. Taehyung, the Jazz Club Rebellion, a baritone's refusal to smile. Let's tear down the pristine velvet curtains and expose the deeply guarded, wildly rebellious 2026 reality of the man the entire world crowned as the ultimate visual masterpiece, Kim Taehyung, universally known as V. For a solid decade, Taehyung was the undisputed, literal poster boy of the K-pop industry, the CGV, whose dangerously sharp jawline, deep soulful eyes, and intensely captivating gaze could effortlessly crash social media platforms and sell out luxury fashion campaigns in mere seconds. But to reduce him to a mere visual or a quirky, unpredictable idol was always the industry's most fatal, agonizing mistake. Deep beneath the heavy designer clothes, the flashy stage outfits, and the heavily manufactured idol charm beat the fiercely independent, deeply old soul of a classic jazz musician who was accidentally born in the entirely wrong century. When you deeply analyze his breathtakingly soulful, minimalist solo debut, Layover, and his subsequent, incredibly gritty, hardened military service in the Elite Special Task Force, SDT, you begin to realize that the Taehyung who walked out of those heavily fortified barracks in late 2025 was completely, fundamentally unrecognizable from the soft-spoken boy who entered. He had violently shed the suffocating, glittering skin of the global pop idol, trading it for the calloused hands and the intense, unflinching gaze of a man who had faced grueling, highly dangerous anti-terrorism combat training. He had aggressively embraced a raw, unpolished, and intensely private artistic identity. So when the massive multi-billion-dollar 2026 BTS reunion machine violently roared to life, demanding that he step right back into the highly choreographed, brightly lit box of the group's designated ending fairy and cheerful visual magnet, an absolute earth-shattering collision of ideologies occurred behind closed doors. The conflict didn't manifest in loud, dramatic, screaming arguments in the executive boardroom. Instead, it materialized as a chilling, absolute refusal to play the industry's most basic, fundamental games. The HYBE executives, desperately hungering for the viral, hyper-produced visual moments that historically drove their immense merchandise sales and multi-million-dollar album pre-orders, presented Taehyung with a massive series of aggressively vibrant, heavily stylized visual concepts for their highly anticipated 2026 comeback album. They desperately wanted the brightly colored contacts, the dramatic, constantly changing hair colors, and the intense camera-seducing choreography that the global fandom was practically starving for after a years-long drought. Taehyung simply looked at the massive, expensive mood boards, sighed with a heavy, deeply exhausted baritone resonance that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years, and flatly, completely refused all of it. He fiercely demanded to perform in simple, unbranded, tailored vintage suits, absolutely zero heavy idol makeup, and insisted on holding a vintage microphone stand rather than dancing highly synchronized, physically draining routines. He aggressively lobbied for the group's new musical direction to heavily incorporate live, improvised jazz instrumentals, deep, authentic soul influences, and complex, unpredictable R&B vocal runs that would allow his uniquely dark, velvety lower register to finally take the absolute center stage, completely abandoning the high-pitched, auto-tuned, heavily synthesized pop anthems the label was ruthlessly pushing for the global radio markets.
when the terrified A&R department heavily pushed back, nervously arguing that a sudden, jarring pivot to moody, slow-tempo jazz pop would completely alienate their massive, hyper-energetic stadium audiences who expected fireworks and heavy bass drops, Taehyung executed a terrifying silent rebellion that shook the entire group dynamic to its absolute core. He began systematically distancing himself from the group's highly publicized, tightly controlled promotional ecosystem. During the grueling, mandatory group photo shoots for the album jacket, while the other 6 members naturally, almost mechanically slipped back into their bright, energetic poses and synchronized smiles, Taehyung would intentionally stand slightly apart, his expression permanently locked in a cold, impenetrable, and deeply melancholic stare, actively refusing to flash the signature boxy smile the massive camera lenses were desperately begging for. Industry insiders leaked incredibly tense, uncomfortable stories about massive music video shoots where the highly paid director would scream through a megaphone for an idle smile or a cute, playful wink, and Taehyung would simply stare dead into the lens with a chilling, hollow intensity, forcing the panicked production team to either accept his raw, unfiltered emotion or cut the camera entirely and rewrite the scene. This terrifying, unyielding artistic stubbornness created a massive, suffocating tension with the other members, particularly the older Hyungs, who were desperately trying to balance their own individual grueling struggles while desperately attempting to keep the fragile, highly scrutinized group cohesion completely intact. They understood and deeply respected Taehyung's incredible artistic evolution, but they were deeply panicked by his absolute, uncompromising refusal to meet the massive corporate machine even halfway. The distance became agonizingly palpable during their rare, highly anticipated early 2026 live broadcasts. Millions of fans watched in absolute stunned silence as Taehyung physically positioned himself at the extreme far edge of the screen, heavily avoiding eye contact with the camera, speaking only in quiet monosyllabic murmurs when directly addressed, and completely and utterly ignoring the chaotic, playful banter of his brothers that used to make him laugh until he cried. He looked exactly like a captive, majestic, untamed tiger, forcefully locked in a neon-lit plastic cage, quietly suffocating under the blinding artificial studio lights. The relentless, heavily sensationalized Korean media immediately smelled blood and branded him as arrogant and ungrateful, completely misinterpreting his deeply introverted artistic mourning as a toxic, selfish ego trip. But the heartbreaking, undeniable reality was that Taehyung was quietly, intensely grieving the final, definitive death of his youth and grappling with the terrifying realization that his deepest, most authentic musical soul was fundamentally, permanently incompatible with the hyper-commercialized, massively manufactured machine he was permanently chained to by a seemingly unbreakable contract. He spent his precious off hours completely vanishing into the underground, smoky, dimly lit jazz clubs of Itaewon and hidden back alleys of Tokyo, jamming completely anonymously with seasoned, 60-year-old session musicians who didn't care at all about his massive Instagram following, his Billboard records, or his globally recognized flawless face. They only cared about the raw, bleeding, unadulterated emotion he could pour into a saxophone or a vintage microphone at 2 in the morning. This underground sanctuary became his only source of true, uncontaminated artistic oxygen, completely isolating him from the high-octane, incredibly stressful and heavily scrutinized comeback preparations happening at the massive HYBE headquarters. He heavily compartmentalized his life, creating a massive, impenetrable and invisible wall between V of BTS, the multi-million-dollar corporate asset, and Kim Taehyung, the raw, bleeding jazz artist. The 2026 conflict deeply, perhaps permanently, fractured the highly romanticized, symbiotic illusion of the group, brutally exposing the terrifying reality that 7 wildly different, fiercely independent men in their 30s could no longer seamlessly mold themselves into a single, cohesive, perfectly marketable pop product without severely bleeding and losing massive pieces of themselves in the brutal process. Taehyung's silent, unyielding mutiny forced the entire mega-corporation to confront the deeply uncomfortable, undeniable truth that true, undeniable artistic growth often requires violently and unapologetically burning down the very house that built you. He wasn't maliciously rejecting his lifelong brothers. He was fiercely, desperately fighting a one-man war to protect the fragile, authentic artist within him from being completely and utterly devoured by the suffocating, blinding, and soulless spectacle of his own unprecedented historical fame. The agonizing, freezing distance he intensely maintained throughout the grueling year of 2026 was not an act of betrayal or malice, but the ultimate tragic survival mechanism of a deeply misunderstood genius who realized that sometimes, to keep your very soul alive in a world built on plastic illusions, you have to completely, permanently stop smiling for the camera.
Number 1. Jungkook, The Golden Eclipse, a prodigy's solo ascendancy. Let's tear open the final, most devastatingly profound chapter of this entire saga, focusing squarely on the man who holds the entire world in the palm of his heavily tattooed hands, Jungkook, the undisputed Golden Maknae. For a solid 13 years, Jungkook's entire existence was deeply, inextricably rooted in the shadows and the protective guidance of his 6 older brothers. He was the wide-eyed 15-year-old kid from Busan who famously cried when his Hyungs were exhausted, the sponge who absorbed their distinct musicalities, their habits, and their dreams until he became the ultimate, flawless weapon of the BTS arsenal. But the 2026 conflict surrounding Jungkook was not born out of rebellion, creative differences, or physical limitations like the others. It was born from a terrifying, unprecedented, and stratospheric level of absolute solo supremacy that completely shattered the deeply ingrained traditional power dynamic of the septet. To truly comprehend the massive, tectonic shift that almost tore the group's foundation apart upon their highly anticipated 2026 reunion, you have to rewind to his earth-shattering pre-enlistment solo era with the monumental Golden album and the historic global domination of singles like Seven and Standing Next to You. Jungkook didn't just step out of the group's shadow, he completely, irrevocably eclipsed the entire sun. He had organically transformed into a Western-facing, globe-conquering pop titan, rubbing shoulders with the world's biggest industry heavyweights, dominating the Billboard Hot 100 as a completely standalone entity, and cultivating a ferocious, incredibly mature and explicit artistic persona that left the sanitized, heavily monitored idol world entirely in the dust. When he finally walked out of his rigorous, heavily disciplined military service in late 2025, possessing an even more intimidating, battle-hardened physique and an unbreakable mental fortitude, the global music industry was practically on its knees, begging for his solo return. So when the massive HYBE machinery forcefully attempted to seamlessly slot the 28-year-old, heavily tattooed global megastar back into the highly regimented, neatly packaged little brother role for the 2026 BTS comeback, an incredibly agonizing, deeply emotional friction erupted that nobody, not even the members themselves, was fully prepared to navigate. The conflict manifested as a profoundly uncomfortable, heavily unspoken realization that the golden child no longer fundamentally needed the group to survive or thrive. During the grueling, high-stakes 2026 comeback preparations, industry insiders and breathless media outlets reported a chilling, massive psychological distance between Jungkook and the older members. It wasn't fueled by arrogance, ego, or malice, but by the terrifying
terrifyingly isolating reality of his unparalleled individual fame. While the other members were fiercely battling their own internal demons regarding the group's legacy and their physical limitations, Jungkook was simultaneously fielding multi-million-dollar solo world tour offers, massive international brand ambassadorships, and direct personal collaborations from legendary Western pop icons that demanded his immediate, singular attention. The HYBE executives found themselves trapped in an agonizing, impossible corporate tug-of-war, desperately trying to prioritize the highly lucrative, nostalgic BTS reunion while absolutely terrified of accidentally stifling the unfathomable money-printing momentum of the biggest solo pop star on the planet. This intense, suffocating corporate pressure inevitably bled deeply into the sacred, fiercely guarded practice rooms. When the group tried to collaboratively arrange the vocal distributions and center time for their new lead single, an agonizing, deafening silence would often consume the room. The older members, historically accustomed to guiding and gently directing the youngest, found themselves unconsciously deferring to him, acutely, painfully aware that his singular voice and his raw, aggressive stage presence were now the primary commercial driving forces keeping the entire corporate empire afloat. Jungkook, fiercely loyal and deeply, profoundly loving toward his brothers, agonized intensely over this terrifying shift in the dynamic. He desperately wanted to be just the bratty, playful maknae again, wrestling playfully with Jimin, seeking intellectual validation from Namjoon, and eating late-night fried chicken with Jin. But every single time he opened his mouth in the recording booth, effortlessly executing incredibly complex, highly advanced R&B vocal acrobatics that he had mastered during his solo era in the States, it served as a brutal, undeniable sonic reminder that he had permanently outgrown the nest. He began intentionally, painfully shrinking himself, deliberately asking the audio producers to lower his microphone volume in the final mixes, and aggressively pushing the visual directors to place him at the far edges of the choreography formations, desperately trying to artificially rebalance the group and prevent himself from completely overshadowing the very men who raised him. This heartbreaking, deeply misguided self-sabotage created a massive, suffocating emotional rift within the team. The older brothers, possessing an immense, profound love for him, immediately recognized his agonizing internal struggle and forcefully, aggressively intervened. In a deeply emotional, highly secretive, and heavily rumored late-night meeting in March 2026, the six Hyungs essentially forced Jungkook to sit down and brutally confronted the massive elephant in the room. They passionately, tearfully told him that aggressively hiding his massive, blinding light to artificially protect their egos was the ultimate betrayal of everything they had sacrificed to build him into the golden prodigy he had become. They fiercely demanded that he stepped fully, unapologetically into his unparalleled solo power, even if it meant permanently altering the synchronized, equal parts dynamic they had fiercely protected for 13 years. But for Jungkook, this incredibly loving, selfless permission felt like a terrifying, devastating form of abandonment. He perceived it as his brothers slowly, gently pushing him out of the safe, familiar boat and abandoning him in the massive, terrifying ocean of permanent solo superstardom, deeply terrified that if he fully embraced his absolute individual dominance, he would lose the only true, unconditional family he had ever known. The agonizing, freezing distance the global public and the relentless media obsessively analyzed throughout 2026, the separate, heavily guarded flights, the vastly different, highly mature luxury styling, his distinct, almost isolated presence during group interviews, where he would stare thoughtfully into the distance rather than engaging in the chaotic, joyful banter of the past, was absolutely not the result of a massive, explosive falling out or a toxic power struggle. It was the deeply tragic, profound human mourning of a brotherhood that was violently forced to evolve under the absolutely crushing, unforgiving weight of unprecedented, historical global supremacy. Jungkook's 2026 conflict is the ultimate, heartbreaking paradox of ultimate success. What do you exactly do when the absolute, dizzying pinnacle of your lifelong, desperate dream fundamentally separates you from the very people you desperately wanted to share it with? His silent, agonizing, and highly publicized struggle to bridge the massive, terrifying canyon between his new identity as the world's most untouchable solo pop titan and his deeply ingrained desperate need to simply be the youngest, cherished brother of BTS completely redefined the entire meaning of their legacy. It brutally and definitively proved to the entire watching world that sometimes the most agonizing, terrifying distance of all is created not by failure, not by betrayal, and not by a lack of love, but by a level of blinding, explosive success that no one, not even the strongest, most legendary family in modern music history, could have ever fully prepared for.
And there you have it, pop culture detectives, the raw, unfiltered, and deeply heartbreaking reality behind the massive 2026 BTS distance that completely broke the internet and left millions of fans entirely breathless. We finally peeled back the heavily manufactured corporate layers and exposed the deeply human, agonizing truth. These 7 legendary brothers didn't drift apart because of petty jealousy, malicious hatred, or toxic greed. They distanced themselves because the suffocating, glittering idol box they were placed inside over a decade ago simply couldn't contain the massive, fiercely independent adult artists they had all violently evolved into. The absolute hardest, most terrifying pill for the global fandom to inevitably swallow is the profound realization that true, unconditional brotherhood doesn't always mean standing shoulder to shoulder on a blindingly lit stadium stage for the rest of eternity, endlessly recreating the magic of their youth. Sometimes the most profound, agonizing act of love is having the absolute courage to let go of each other's hands so you can finally learn how to walk entirely on your own in the dark without the safety net of the group. The BTS of 2026 was a collective entity actively mourning the definitive end of their youth while desperately, fiercely fighting for their individual artistic survival in a brutal, hyper-commercialized industry that famously devours its most precious creations the second they show human fatigue. They proved to the entire watching world that growing up is an incredibly painful, profoundly isolating, and inherently messy process, even when you have billions of dollars, unparalleled global influence, and the biggest, most dedicated fandom on the planet aggressively analyzing your every single microscopic move. So, what do you guys truly think about this massive tectonic shift in their legendary dynamic? Do you think this necessary, incredibly painful, emotional, and physical distance will ultimately destroy the sacred legacy they spent their entire lives building? Or is it the exact brutal evolution they desperately needed to undergo in order to survive the next decade as true, untouchable, standalone musical icons? Drop your deepest, most honest theories and emotional reflections in the comments down below. Smash that like button if this raw, unfiltered documentary completely shattered your perspective on the idol industry. And absolutely make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another explosive deep dive into the hidden, heavily guarded truths of the global pop culture universe. Until next time, keep questioning the manufactured narrative. Stay fiercely curious, and always remember that behind every single perfect, highly synchronized idol smile, there is always a wildly complex, beautifully flawed human being silently fighting a massive psychological war you know absolutely nothing about.